Welcome to Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works, a podcast for teachers, instructional coaches, administrators, and anyone else who supports teachers in the classroom. This show is a proud member of the BE Podcast Network, shows that help you go beyond education. Find all our shows at bepodcastnetwork.com. I am Gene Tavernetti, the host for this podcast, and my goal for this episode, like all episodes, is that you laugh at least once and that you leave with an actionable idea for better teaching. A quick reminder, no cliches, no buzzwords, only stuff that works. My guest today is Sean Morrissey. Sean is a fifth grade teacher at Pinehurst Elementary School in the Frontier Central School District located just outside of Buffalo, New York. He is a former school psychologist who spent 8 years supporting students' academic and behavioral needs before transitioning into the classroom, where he has spent the past 18 years teaching students in the first, fourth, and fifth grades. Grounded in the science of learning and the science of reading, Sean's work focuses on helping students build strong connections between sound, spelling, and meaning to support long-term vocabulary and literacy development. He is the creator and author of the Word Mapping Project Curriculum, a structured morphology-rich approach designed to make the inner workings of words visible and meaningful to students. Through his teaching and professional development work, Sean emphasizes practical, research-aligned strategies that help educators deliver explicit, effective vocabulary and word study instruction with clarity and confidence. I think you're going to like this one. Sean, thank you for being on Better Teaching, Only Stuff That Works.
I'm very excited to be here, Gene.
Well, I'm very happy to have a chance to talk to you about something that I'm very interested in. It always comes up in my work with teachers, and that is vocabulary. And one of the things that I'm really interested in, especially, hearing your background about being a school psych before you became a teacher, was what did you bring from the school psych life to becoming a teacher and now having a focus on vocabulary?
Yeah, I think honestly the word is research. So I think the schools of education versus school psych is very much more research oriented. And when I was an undergrad, I was lucky enough to study under a big researcher, William Pelham. He researched students with ADHD. So I kind of learned the research process, and how empirically validated treatments was kind of like the term used in psychology, that we should be using treatments for students that had the best chance of working. So that definitely came over into education. Interesting, in my school psych program, during a consultation class, we were taught not to use the word research with teachers. That is a consultation tactic that teachers don't like that word, and they're not going to listen to you if you say the research says so. And that consultation class proved kind of correct. 25 years ago, a lot of teachers didn't want to hear oh, this has research support behind it and things like that, which was really interesting to me. So there was definitely, I think with school psych, it kind of brought me oh, you need to read a lot of the research. And when I became a practicing school psychologist, I think I realized early on a lot of the students that were getting referred to me were for reading, for suspected reading disabilities. So I definitely had to start reading a lot on the reading process and things like that. I remember early on, the National Reading Panel, I think I read it cover to cover maybe twice, kind of the full version, because I needed to know. And I don't think I got a ton of training in the reading component during my graduate program. So research was big for me. So I kind of started off really focused on reading as much as possible.
So a lot of the school psych's jobs that I know about, unfortunately, a lot of it is just assessment. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that was your life, a lot of it was assessment. And so you are getting referrals for kids who aren't reading well. When did you start putting things together that maybe part of this just had to do with instruction, that there really wasn't any sort of, identifiable condition or disability or whatever word we're supposed to be using now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think as part of the evaluation process, I was fortunate to observe in hundreds of classrooms. So like I definitely like before like as now as a teacher, like I think that gave me a really great foundation. But back in the day, it was balanced literacy, like in my district and in other districts, it was Fontes and Pinnell, Lucy Calkins, where I'm observing students during like the ELA block and the teacher is working with a small group, generally doing reading strategies in the upper elementary grades, or maybe they're doing somewhat of a phonics lesson, but then all the other kids are at stations. But when I'm observing students like in stations, there are times where a student was off task almost the entire time. So we're talking like an hour of an ELA block. And I was very research based where I had a headset and I would record every 30 seconds if a student looked like they were paying attention. And I would observe another student that was like, and I would rotate like the typical peers. And there'd be times where, I would be rating the student off task almost the whole time, for that hour. And then, you're looking at the instruction and, students are reading like a level C book where, none of the phonics patterns carried over like in a kindergarten classroom or an early first grade. And it didn't make sense to me. And it then as a psych trying to assess for a true reading disability, it's almost impossible to do that. There's no blood test. You're taking like the culmination of all this evidence, but when a student is off task a lot, like you're not using like research-based methods, how do you tell if the student truly has a learning disability or not? Obviously some students, struggle more and you could see that, but it was really difficult. That is one of the reasons why I started to think about moving it into teaching. I had a really difficult time with that. It was hard
So
for me.
when you moved into teaching, were you able to carry a lot of good things that you witnessed, or were you more of a, well, I'm not going to do that. That's something I saw that
I,
I'm going to do differently.
I think it was honestly both because you're in like hundreds of classrooms, Gene, and there were some teachers who just were brilliant, and you're like, oh, definitely they had the management down. They just you could see the kids are like 100% active participation with students. But then on the reverse side of that, there's definitely things like yes, when I started in first grade, I'm not going to have all these centers where the kids are just off task because you can't manage, like it's really hard even when you're an expert teacher to manage that all, like the cognitive load of trying to teach a small group and then have things people say, oh, we can do it, but it's really difficult.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a both. It was definitely both for sure.
So you moved in, so you left, said goodbye to school psychology, and you moved into the classroom.
Yeah.
Were you as interested in vocabulary development in the beginning, or was it something that you just saw, wait a second, there's a deficit here somewhere in our curriculum, and I need to do something about it? How did that develop?
Yeah, I think it was honestly from the get-go early on, and I don't remember what year it was, but I read Bringing Words to Life, Isabel Beck and Margaret McCowan's book. And interesting, when I switched over to the classroom, I went through an alternate pathway. So I never student taught. So I worked at a preschool to kind of get my hours and to get my certification in New York State. My first true lesson was my observation lesson for teaching. So like, I applied in my own district, but I had to apply for the job. And I actually used a vocabulary lesson based on the structures in Bringing Words to Life. So like the structures of like, well, you write about it, you have a book on it. The
Yeah.
structures of a lesson plan are so important. And I remember at the end of that lesson, I'm like, wow, that was my first lesson I've ever done. And it went really smoothly because the structures were in place. And
Yeah.
even the administrators, I think they were pleasantly surprised because they knew I was a reader. I loved like literacy, but coming from the school psych world, I don't know if they thought if I could do it or not, you know, and yeah.
Well, I have to make a confession here. I was following you on Twitter and you said something about bringing words to life. And it's like, it just kind of really got my attention because that was a pivotal book for me. I was already consulting then, but I wasn't applying what was there, but I was sharing with teachers, so, some of the content and told them, this is a great resource and this sort of thing. So I have to say that that was kind of it for me as well,
Mhm.
reading that book and a lot of the thing that was different in the book was something that you talk about in your lesson structure. And I want to talk a little bit about what you just mentioned about the coherent lessons and the structure being so important, because you talk about daily instruction in vocabulary. Can you talk a little bit about what that sequence is, the sequencing of it, and then at some point we want to go back to first day. And so don't worry if you didn't remember everything that I just said there, because I know I want to get back to that day one instruction.
Yeah. So I think like when we think about the lesson structure, you want it to be fairly fast paced where, the kids are still learning throughout, but you have their attention for that whole time. So I always start off with some sort of like review or retrieval practice of what like previous day or days learning. So with vocabulary, it's always like asking kids questions where they turn and talk about words that they learned either the previous day or a couple days before. So, basically you're asking the class a question, quick turn and talk, let's discuss. So they're trying to apply their thinking about previous words right away. So, as kind of that retrieval practice.
So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think when we talk about retrieval practice, I think most people who listen to this podcast understand retrieval practice. But when you're asking about vocabulary words that you learned the day before,
Yeah.
what might a question
Yeah.
look like that you're asking them to retrieve?
Yeah. Okay. So, like, for example, say we learned the words, and I always kind of I like to teach my words in pairs, like segregation and congregation. So, like, I taught those words as a pair previous day. So, like, a question would be like, okay, laws at the time enforced segregation in schools and public places. What might have that meant for how people were treated? And so you're just like it's a general question, but the kids can have somewhat different answers, and they're talking with one another, and then I'm kind of cold calling on certain students there. It could be like, ooh, with trepidation she stepped onto the stage and looked at the crowd. All right, how did she feel in that moment? So like, so then the kids are retrieving like, you're okay, well, what is trepidation? And then, okay, so she has this feeling of like, then, oh, she's feeling anxious, she's nervous, there's a big crowd there. So those are the type of questions that are like what I call retrieval practice, but it's more thinking,
Well,
and giving a variety.
and Sean, that what you just described was what was most important to me in reading that book, the Ways with Words book, because that was the distinction. It wasn't like, here are three possible definitions. Don't
Yeah.
get, no, no, we're not worried about the definition. We're worried about an understanding. And so that's your retrieval, but that's also the way that you check for understanding later and when you teach the words, correct?
Yeah. So, I mean, you could see like with individual students or as a group where, which words do they seem to like pick up right away, as a group, and which words, that are, more difficult for sure. So, like in the future, you're going to spend more time on the ones that the class isn't picking up as quickly as others, for sure.
Okay, so that's the first part of the lesson. You've done the retrieval, and then what's next?
Yeah. So in the first part, I actually like there's a couple of retrievals there where I am so interesting with vocabulary. I like to tie spelling with it. So when you think of like mapping words in long-term memory, I think people really have to understand you want kids to pronounce the word, you want kids to spell the word, and you want kids to learn the meaning. You want all three of those. Like, if you leave leaving spelling off actually hinders long-term mapping of those words. Spelling actually really helps. So I do a spelling dictation where the kids are listening to the words in context. So it's not like an active retrieval, but they're hearing the words in context in a different way, and then they're spelling those words. So to help map that in long-term memory as well. So spelling dictation is always a part, and a little retrieval of just it's a little bit more memorization, but a little more retrieval of just what does this prefix mean? What does this suffix mean? Like PRE means what? Write it on your wipe off boards. So those are quick though. Like that's like 1 to 2 minutes.
Okay. And so retrieval practice, you having some new content
Yeah.
covering it. And then you say that it is explicit instruction.
Yeah.
And that's a term that means a lot of things to a lot of people. So when you say you're going to do a few minutes of explicit instruction, what does that look like?
Yeah, so I'm teaching the words directly, like I'm teaching the meanings of the words. So so here's kind of what it looks like. So if I say, okay, the next word we're learning is segregation. What's the word? Choral response. We want kids to pronounce that word correctly right away because that helps with mapping that word. Then I'm on the doc under the document camera and I'm putting that word in syllables. We're saying the word in syllables. And then I quickly move into basically giving a student-friendly definition. Like segregation means keeping people or things separated. So it's quick. It's their first exposure. And then a couple of quick examples so they can tie it into context. Like in history, segregation kept people apart based on their race. So you're giving a couple examples just like that. So, but it's quick, it's explicit. You're not like playing guess what's in my head, like, oh, who knows what segregation means? And I mean, we've all done this. Like
Yeah.
and you see teachers do this where, and then you call in a student and a student is totally off. And you're like, no, you call in another student, what does segregation mean? They're totally off. And then all the rest of the class has listened to like three wrong definitions, right? Or three wrong. And then that's what they're thinking about. So I just want to like give them, what it means right away.
A lot of people are, look to you right now as the vocabulary guy. So let's talk about one of the things that still persists, that we can't kill it. And that is, okay, here are vocabulary words for today. I'm going to give you 10 minutes, look them up in the dictionary. Do you ever do that? Is that ever something you do, or does it have its place?
I think, okay, number one is I do that 0% of the time in school.
Okay.
The time is just minutes are precious. And I always think opportunity cost. If I'm going to have kids look up definitions for 10 minutes, that's 10 minutes that they're not doing something else. And are they really going to learn the words based on like it's just not a great use of time. I mean, certainly if a student is reading at home, they're reading their independent book and they don't know a word, like yeah, like encouraging students to look up meanings of words, like I would encourage that. But doing that in school, I think we're too time poor. Yeah.
And what do you say to the folks who say, will say, well, you're just spoon feeding them. You're just spoon feeding them this information.
Yeah, there's a lot of words in the English language, and of course, we can't teach them all, but there are a lot of really important words that kids need to know. And if they don't, it's going to really hurt their reading comprehension going into middle and high school and even beyond. So we have to, like in spoon feeding, like we just want kids to learn. Like I'm going to teach them and they're going to listen and practice. And it's not just like the definitions too. Like when you get into like if I'm teaching segregation, I'll teach congregation right after. But then like within that explicit instruction routine, right away I'm asking kids to differentiate between those two words. So I'm giving them examples right away. So like if you think it's kind of like guided practice where like okay, so the people came together to sing and pray. Is that segregation? Is that congregation? So they're differentiating, but it's very structured. And right away you want more correct answers, and so you're not making it too hard. But then the kids are spelling those words on mini whiteboards as well, so they're getting spelling practice. So I don't like, I wouldn't call that spoon feeding because you're always making them think. Like that's the
You
whole
know,
point of it, right?
people can't see me, but I'm smiling so big because, yes, I mean, there are just some things that need to be mediated by adults. And I
Mhm.
imagine that the way that you present that content, which by the way is exactly the way you do the retrieval, you put the words together. So the kids have an understanding of how these words are going to be presented. But those are sophisticated words. And as I'm thinking about, the different tiers, and I'm thinking about, oh, you're doing social studies, is segregation a tier two word or a tier three word? It's irrelevant. They
Right.
they still they still need a mediation from an adult.
Yeah. And even with that, like I'm like, who cares if we're someone categorizes a tier two or three word, but like even with the word segregation, breaking it up, and we can get more into morphology, but like breaking it up into its parts, then you're gonna think about other words that have those different morphemes in it. Like in segregation, Greg means flock. And segregation, SC, the prefix, like the group, you're breaking it apart, versus congregation, CON being the prefix there, which is with or together. So then you're like kind of layering that in, and you're scaling up and having kids think about the parts of the words as well. So you're always wanting kids to be thinking about the whole word, the parts of the word, and things like that.
So, okay, four parts of your lesson. So far, we've talked about the retrieval, which includes spelling and
Yeah.
dictation, the explicit instruction, which
Yeah.
you've just described, and then you have fluency passages.
Yeah, so fluency passages, you want like after explicit instruction, you want students to be reading those words in context. So you want kids to be pronouncing those words. And these are hard tier two words. Like when you think about, and they're multi-syllabic words. So for upper elementary kids, they're not always easy to pronounce. Like when you think about like trepidation, segregation, confidence, like congregation. So you're embedding those words into a fluency passage. So then students are going through a nice fluency routine. And the fluency routine is, there's so much research on different fluency routines that work, but you're just embedding those words. So they're practicing those words in context as well. And it kind of changes up the lesson. So the kids get up, they move with their partners. And I think they're mentally, they're like even refreshed. They're still with it in the lesson because you kind of changed it and you broke it up a little bit there. Yeah.
And so, like you said, there are various fluency routines. So it's not the exact same thing every time, or do you do the exact same routine
Yeah,
every time?
so that is all going to be dependent on the students in your classroom, grade level. For example, if I'm a third grade teacher and my students are less fluent, I may be reading that passage first aloud so the kids can hear fluent reading. They can hear, especially the focus words more. They're hearing it in context from you. So for sure, you could even have kids chorally read as a class one time before they break up into partners. If your class in fifth grade, if you have a fairly more on the fluent side of fifth grade, those kids may not need all that scaffolding. They may be able to jump right into partnerships. And, because time is precious, the more time you spend on a fluency passage, it's important. But if your class is fairly fluent and you can move through that routine a little bit quicker, then you have more time to do something else. But even in my class, I have a very wide range this year. For a couple of my strugglers, when they do break into partners, I'll use like an echo routine where the more fluent partner reads a paragraph and the less fluent partner kind of echoes that because they need that scaffold. They need to hear it and then they need to read it right away. It's definitely a big help.
Wow, I got so many things I want to ask you. So after this, let's finish the fourth part, and then we'll go
Okay.
back and ask some questions. And then
Sure.
the fourth part is independent practice.
Yeah,
So what does that look like with these
yeah,
selected words?
just a variety of independent practice routines. It may be like sentences and context where they're filling in previously learned words and they're trying to figure out which one of these words fits in this sentence. So, and it could be words like with like the same like morphology base. It could be like segregate, it could be congregate, it can be like an aggregate or aggregate, it could be gregarious. So just figuring out which words fit in context. It could be writing tasks like because but so, you know, the dogs were segregated because, or something like that, where the kids really have to think and then complete, a sentence in context. So it's just a variety of independent where they're put in there so the kids, you want them to be pretty successful, but you also want them to be thinking the whole time in various ways. Sometimes it's just like, here's a picture, here are like 10 words we just learned in like the last, three or 4 days. Write a short story about this picture and try to embed as many words as you can. And kids love that. Like they want to write stories, and how creative they are to embed some words where as an adult you think, oh, I can, like, they're never going to be able to do this. And they always rise to the occasion, for sure.
So we've talked about your vocabulary lesson, and you're recommending approximately 30 minutes a day that you're spending on this. And most elementary schools where I work, at elementary, by the way, where I am, it's the same as elementary where you are.
Okay.
I learned that in New York. I had never heard elementary, so I was ready for you, Sean. So most elementary blocks are like at least 90 minutes. Sometimes they're 120 minutes.
Yeah.
So you described a big portion of this block as designated for vocabulary, but it sounds like you embedded a lot of stuff in there.
Yeah. So it's just kind of layering things. So like I think vocabulary, if people look at the lesson, yes, vocabulary stands out, but you're also spelling throughout the lesson as well. There's fluency within the lesson. So a lot of times I think, programs or teachers, like they like put all those things into different parts, but I don't think we have to put them into parts. Can we put them in a structure that like makes sense and everything's interconnected, where, okay, it is vocabulary, but it also is fluency. It also is spelling. And then there's the other piece that kind of ties it all in. It also is morphology. So it's bigger than just learning like this word here or this word there.
So we made reference several times to tier two and tier three words. We haven't mentioned tier one words. Could you just give a brief description for everybody who might not be up on what those tiers are, what they mean?
Yeah. So tier one words are like really common words that like kids would just know unless you're new to the language. So house, ball, run, those are tier one words that generally students know. We wouldn't want to spend time teaching them those because they already know them. Tier two words, I kind of break these up a little bit, maybe differently than some. I would say like descriptive vocabulary words that are harder than typical words we use in speech, like words for happy, like euphoric, elated, jubilant. Sometimes we don't use those even as teachers in our daily like talk. I would consider like those descriptive vocabulary words as tier two words. Then I would consider like academic vocabulary, that words that come up in content areas like science or social, like function or aspect or characteristic or feature. Those would be considered tier two words because they're really important. They come up a fair amount, but we may not necessarily use them in our daily language that much. But these are vital words for kids to know, or it could really, if they don't, it's going to really hinder their comprehension of the material for sure.
And then the tier three?
Yeah, tier three words are like specific to like the content area. Like maybe like photosynthesis for science, that would be more like of a three word that we're going to generally teach that in the content area where, for the most part.
So it sounds like a lot of work has to be, and the work that we just described in your lesson, mainly tier two. There could be some tier three, but mainly
Yeah.
tier two words. How do you determine which tier two words to use to teach?
Yeah. So I don't think there's not a like a perfect answer for this. There are a couple lists out there. Like there's a list called Coxede's Academic Word List. I think they're out of Australia. I think about 25 years ago, they actually looked up the corpus of like words that are in like a lot of like high school and college textbooks, and they kind of ranked ordered what words came up more often. Like the word benefit would be one of those words. So, like that list, there's a lot of words that come up a lot that I think are important to teach. But, after like those lists, it's just like words that, you think that would be really important for kids to know and how to like scale that up. Like, if you're doing words for happy, let's talk and teach a bunch of those. Let's not just do one. Let's really focus on, satisfied, content, elated, euphoric, and getting some range of like happiness as well. So it's just like studying words in groups. I think some words in groups are more important, like words for change. There's so many important words that have to do, with change. You have evolve, you have adapt, you have morph, so like thinking about all of those type of words, I think like in some of those categories are really important.
So as you choose these words and wherever teachers get a list like that, do they include the morphology that you talk about, or is that something that you need to now create? Or do the lists include some of that content? Or is this is where your work benefits the teachers?
Yeah, I think like, I've embedded morphology just in my daily lessons. I think it's part of it because morphology is one way you could really scale up vocabulary learning because if you know a certain base means something, you can kind of start picking up other words as well. So I think morphology ties it all together. Like for example, cult, meaning to grow. You know, you have aquaculture, right? Then you're thinking, oh, what does aqua mean? You have agriculture, you have cultivate, you even have like words like multicultural, uncultured. So, trying to put various different words, but that kind of hold that same base is important.
So what do you think what's your goal for a year? If you're doing this a whole year. Like, is there a number of words? Is
Uh,
that even a nonsense question? Or
No, so I'm a little bit of an outlier here, Gene. So like you'll read in books like kids can only learn this amount of words and we should only teach kids like, five, 10 words a week and things like that. I don't like to put any constraints. Like typically I probably within a 2 week period throughout all my subject areas, I'm probably teaching over 50 words. Yeah, for sure. Like you're talking about 25 words, probably five different words a day, which seems kind of crazy. But if your lessons are if you are in your lessons and you're making sure there's a ton of different opportunities that the kids are seeing these words and thinking about the words and using the words and it's structured in that way, kids can pick them up. But that's the hard thing for teachers. It takes a lot of planning time. Like it's not, I think vocabulary is difficult because it takes a lot of planning time to do it all.
well, I think one of the things that I heard you on another podcast or saw you someplace, you talked about being able to expand the number of words and that maybe they weren't as specifically taught, but they continued to be used in your language as a teacher,
Yeah.
almost as a positives. Like you kept going back to them and just the repetition,
Yeah.
the kids would pick it up. Am I correct how you do that?
Of 100% correct. Like, I think that's one thing that every year I think over the last 15, 20 years, every year I slowly get a little better, and I'm just using more words in daily language. I don't know what the study was. I forgot the authors, but there was a study done, it was in second grade on vocabulary, and they actually taped teachers like throughout the course of the year. And the students that were the best readers, that had the best reading comprehension, the teachers, they had the teachers who used more sophisticated words throughout the day, which was like a big, like, so just using words throughout the day is so important. And they don't even have to be words that are sort of like in your like vocabulary lessons. Like, for example, the word ambiguous. It's, right away, like you're giving kids directions. The kids aren't following them very well. I never yell at the kids. It's like, yeah, it was my fault, obviously, right? So I'm like, ooh, those directions were ambiguous. They were not clear. So I'm like giving a little definition right with that. And let me make those directions more clear. But if you say like ambiguous like that, like a few times throughout like that week, the kids just naturally pick up on what that means. And you didn't have to do like a lot of explicit instruction with that. It's like I use this as example, like concur. In my first grade colleague, I gave her that one about 2 weeks ago, and her first graders have been using it. And like even the other day, she came up to me and she's like, "Oh my goodness!" Like one of the kids answered the questions, and one of our other first graders kind of said like, "Oh, I concur with Mary," like just like said it like that, and so like it's very cool. And she just started using it in language, like, because I told her, oh, just use concur and like say, oh, do you agree? And the kids, like, she did it, a bunch of times, but it didn't take, it wasn't, there was no time off from instruction, right? She's just saying, oh, like if you normally say, hey, do you agree with Mary? Do you concur? Do you agree with Mary? There's no more time, for instruction there, and the kids are naturally picking it up. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And like you said, it takes some awareness from the teacher's part, not necessarily a lot of time, but just an awareness of
Yeah.
of the opportunities. Like this is an opportunity.
Yeah. I think we need to do, and this is definitely what I think we need to do, is we need to have words like that are like written down for us, because the cognitive load for teachers, you are trying to manage a million different things, and you will not go back to words like that, especially if this is more newer to you. You need it there to look, oh, I need to use this word today. And so it's almost, like sort of in your lesson at the like, oh, I'm going to use these two words today. I'm going to try to use them 3 times. I'm going to use these couple words the next day. And maybe Thursday and Friday, you try to use like those 5 or 6 words just in your daily language. But they need to be written down, or you just don't think about it.
I could see that would be a nice grade level activity or PLC activity or something, just coming up with these lists because so many times there are nice lists, as you mentioned, but they don't know you, they don't know your kids, they don't know where you're going. And it's nice that at the end of the year, you've got not just Sean's class, but every class
Yeah.
has had an opportunity. Well, I
Yeah.
want to talk about tier three words for a second. And you mentioned that tier three words are the related to the disciplines. And so,
Yeah.
for example, you use the example of photosynthesis, might be a word
Yeah.
that you're going to be teaching.
Yeah.
I'm going to make a statement based on our conversation so far, and if you concur, let me know. So photosynthesis doesn't seem to be one of those words that would be taught explicitly as a vocabulary word. It seems to me photosynthesis needs a much deeper explanation about what's going on. And the reason that I'm asking you this is because I know a lot of teachers, when we talk about vocabulary, they make no distinction between what are the concepts that they're going to teach in the
Yeah.
lesson that have a term tied to it versus just I concur. I mean,
Right.
there's a big difference. There's a
Right.
big difference there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because the photosynthesis is a process, so you're teaching that within the process of that unit. You're not going to like, just teach that kind of out of the blue. That needs to be a process. Now, I will say, after kids learn that word, like within the science concept, you could pull the morphemes out of that word, like photo meaning light, but you know, generally that would come after. That would come after.
It's almost as a cue for them to remember the concept,
Yeah,
but knowing it beforehand, it's like reading a dictionary definition. It's not really that useful unless you know what's underneath it.
right, right, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you're doing your vocabulary routine, those tier three words are not in them, are not in they're going to be in your lessons about the content.
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, there are some words like if people want to like maybe say like democracy or autocracy. Maybe some people may consider those tier three words, but you know, in parts, if you're teaching the root CRACY, meaning rule, sometimes just teaching all those words because they are anchored back to that base that means rule. Like I don't think that's a bad thing to do either, because then they're like, oh, autocracy, one ruler, and then but in general, doing that within the unit, I think is definitely more powerful. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because even those examples like autocracy and democracy, there are still a lot to understand that the kids need some mediation on
Yeah.
those terms. It's not enough to say, "Oh, we're going to vote on it."
Yeah.
There's still more mediation that needs to
And
happen.
I think what would be, it's interesting is like I wonder like if kids are learning more out of context those words, but they're getting a little bit of a base, if they're learning then when the content comes will be a little quicker, as well. But that's hard because you don't want to wait too much for words like that until you're getting into really in-depth, kind of conceptual work in high school. You know what I mean? Like so there's a
Well,
middle ground, I think, in
well,
sometimes.
yeah. Well, I think in social studies that really is a dilemma because we want to build this content knowledge, but it's at a 7-year-old level.
Yeah,
So what does democracy mean when you're 7
right.
versus, learning about the electoral college? I mean,
Yeah,
it's a very different type of thing.
yeah.
Well, it's interesting, as I was what reading Twitter once, and there was a teacher was sharing with you about the excitement that their kids had about learning vocabulary. And I was talking to a friend of mine, and I said, I could just imagine that teacher is just a geek about learning words and just loves language. And whatever identity a teacher has, that excitement is going to spill over to the kids. And then I was talking about you with my friend, and I said, I bet Sean's like that. I bet Sean's like that. Is that how you were?
I've been totally the opposite. So I grew up in a little city outside of Buffalo, and like I was always an okay student. Like I think I excelled in math, but my language was never like really strong. People who know the SAT, like I think I struggled to get a 500 on the ELA portion of the SAT. And I just remember the analogies. I had no idea how these words were related. And like something like you get there, oh, you got to practice before college. And I'm like practicing with these books, I don't know how many, like a lot of years ago, but I had no idea. So my language was never, I don't think my language was strong early on. I think honestly, my language now is much stronger just because I'm teaching the words
Yeah,
and
interesting.
I'm teaching the morphology. I think I've scaled up. If I was ever tested and we had like a longitudinal test, I think the last 10 years I have a little spike because just of teaching it. I'm better at it. Yeah.
So we're getting near the end here. So thinking about teachers who just haven't really done a lot of work in vocabulary, or it's been very rudimentary, or it's been things that just haven't been effective. What advice would you give them for getting started?
Yeah, I think no, number one, small steps. You're not this isn't going to be an overnight process. I think for me, every year I try to, slowly get better. I think number one, though, explicit instruction. Like I share my routines, on social media where teaching pairs of words, steal that, take that, and use that in all your content areas. So, like for example, whatever reading program you use, they usually will like say, okay, they pick some words out of this chapter. Okay, take the word that they pick and then find a really good antonym or a word that's not related and use the structured routine I use because I think, having kids learn two words and then they're differentiating right away spelling them, like that's something that you could take and implement tomorrow in your classroom for sure. And one summer, and I did this, sometimes it just takes hard work. I studied prefixes, suffixes, I studied roots. And that summer, I'm really glad I did because, you know, the I just learned a lot. And then when words come up now, just, off the cuff, I'm just much more comfortable. I can stop now, and discuss, parts of a word like I couldn't, 10, 15 years ago. So some of it is just, going online. What are the most common prefixes? What are the most common roots? And starting to just do a little self-study.
You are, in addition to just in a broad sense, the vocabulary guy, also so much work in morphology, which we did not talk about much at all. We did
Yeah.
not talk about much at all. So again, in addition to your work, which they have access to, and we'll put it in the show notes, where they could contact you, what should a teacher think about morphology? They're intimidated by it.
Yeah.
Any suggestions for that?
Definitely. I'm a big believer in word sums and word matrices. So, you can go online and look those up. So now I'm pretty good at creating those on my own. So it's a little bit, there's a little bit of work learning how to create those on your own. There is, we could put in the show notes. There is a website which it's called Mini Matrix Maker, Neil Ramsden, where you can make those on your own. But having kids look at a matrix and seeing prefixes, like thinking about like the matrix, like using the word cult, you know, then you have like a suffix URE, culture. So they see these word parts in a matrix, and kids are putting those words in word sums where they're actually, okay, prefix plus the base or the root plus the suffix, and then they're writing the whole word and they're really playing with words there. Oh, is this a real word? And then teachers discussing, learning more about word sums and morphology matrices, definitely worth your time for sure.
The other thing that the way you talk about it, I could also see a lot of these activities like as sponge activities. You're lined up at the door and you're asking these questions. Turn to your partner. The kid that was frightened on the what was the word? The kid that was frightened to go on stage. It was
Trepidation.
trepidation. Trepidation. Oh, we're having hamburgers today at lunch. Anybody have any
It,
trepidation about eating lunch?
and the fun part of it is sometimes like you just have these moments. Like I just wrote about this just yesterday. So I had a moment where a student gave me well, I kind of commandeered this student's pen, and I've had it for like the last 2 months, and I always lose my pens. This is the first one. It has like a big hand on it. I love this pen. Well, the other day I'm writing down under the document camera and it runs out of ink. And I really played it up. Like I was just so distraught. And I paused, like there was like silence, and the kids kind of were like chuckling. But then the kids started playing because like they know like we're all kind of word nerds now. And literally when the first kid goes, Mr. Morrissey, you look a bit distraught. And I like kind of nod. And then one student shouts out, "Oh, he's solemn." And then one other student's like, "He's feeling melancholy." So I'm like getting like giddy here. And one from the back's like, he's almost despondent. So, and that's just like just like natural,
Yeah.
just so much fun. And then like at the end there, one of my students came up, gave me a pat on the back, and I'm just like, oh, thank you for being so compassionate. And it ended with one of my students took their little like pen cartridge out of their pen and held it up and like, we can transplant this, Mr. Morrissey. So yeah, it just like those are the moments where like, ooh, the whole class is like on board.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's great. Sean, I could talk to you all day about this. You have any questions for me?
Like eh, thinking about, yeah, a couple. Like when you wrote kind of what your books are, and we want like, I have so much collaboration like on X, which like professionally, I think that kind of saved me, where it seems like it's really hard for schools still collaborating, like even for new teachers to be like coming up to veteran teachers, asking questions and that. It still seems like we're not quite there yet. And some schools don't have coaching models. How do we kind of break that where people feel comfortable like trying to learn from others outside of maybe like Twitter, outside of X?
Well, man, you asked a big
It's a loaded
question.
question. Yeah.
It's a big question. I'm going to give you a small answer, and it is something that is so common that I think you're going to recognize it. And your original question had to do about being able to collaborate, coming together to talk about
Yeah.
things. And gosh, it's going to get back to some vocabulary, and that is there needs to be a shared vocabulary about instruction. Just like kept going back and asking you to clarify what you're doing with regards to explicit instruction, there is no agreement about a lot of the things we do about instruction.
Hmm.
If you're on X, and you mentioned something about, oh, this is what I do for retrieval. Sure enough, somebody's going to say, well, that's not retrieval. That's not it. That's a lethal mutation. And then it says, well, what about this? What about that? And so I think one of the first things when we ever work with a district is let's come up with a shared vocabulary.
Hmm.
And it's not a shared vocabulary. Gosh, it goes right back to what you're talking about, Sean. It's not a shared vocabulary of, okay, here are some potential definitions. Do we agree on the definition? No. What does it look like in action? What does it look like operationalized? Can we distinguish between this and this, given this situation? So
Hmm.
it takes that's the first step. Otherwise, you cannot communicate. Another thing that you said before, it's complicated. Teaching is complicated. And so there are all of these different moments that we have to name somehow
Yeah.
and agree on it. Because you could have a grade level meeting and you could be talking about things and say, we're going to do explicit instruction. And okay, great, that sounds great. You do what you just described, and somebody does, well, I'm going to have the kids look them up in the dictionary and then we're going to talk about it. So that's the first thing. Agree on some vocabulary, but not just on the words. Agree on what it looks like,
Hmm.
and so now we can talk about it. If you don't, then you just wasted your time.
Yeah.
Now, how you get to that is the question, and that takes some professional development. It takes some coaching, because the other thing about professional development, if you just talked about this, that we need a shared vocabulary, a real common thing that teachers will say, we already do that.
Yeah.
We already do retrieval. We already do this. And so if you don't have an opportunity to be observed, to check that, then we really don't know what's going on. And that gets back to, eventually down the road, what we need is to Sean to be able to come into Gene's class and see what I'm doing and vice versa.
Yeah.
And now we can talk about it because we could talk about, oh, this is where I'm doing the explicit instruction. This is where I'm doing the practice, et cetera, et cetera. But there's just too many assumptions that we know what the other person is talking about.
Right.
And that was one of the reasons that I wanted in my questions today is to clarify some of those things because it's easy to look at your four things that you do, say, I do that. I do that. Maybe you call it that, but it's not the same. It's not the same thing.
Yeah. And I think videotaping, and I've just started to do this in the last year or so, videotaping lessons is a game changer. So because I think it helps others like, oh, that's what it looks like.
Yeah.
And it also like like when you're reflecting on like your own, watching yourself, it's a little humble, like you're, like, oh boy, that student wasn't paying attention for 10 whole minutes and I didn't like, and like you're a veteran teacher. It's like, oh, and I didn't even notice that because teaching's hard. There's
Yeah.
so much involved, and videotaping is something that I'm going to keep doing as much as possible.
You have status as a teacher on staff, and you're doing that and sharing that. That's important because a lot of teachers are afraid to do that for whatever reason.
Yeah,
And so I think that's important that they know you're doing that and that you're welcome to look,
yeah,
and talk. In fact, if I was a coach at your site, I might even suggest to you, Sean, let anybody who wants to take a look at your lesson, but do it with them so you can
hmm
point out what you did. They didn't know that it took you 6 weeks to develop that routine.
yeah,
They say,
yeah,
I'm going to go do it. And then it
yeah,
doesn't work. And then so I just think that there is so much that a coach can do to move things along more quickly, to help develop that culture that you're talking about, to work with other teachers, to be able to share everything and to be able to talk about it. And the reality is, there is stuff that you've created, but without you talking about it, having a chance to discuss it, it's just going to go over some
yeah,
people's heads.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
well, Sean, it has been a pleasure. I learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to seeing you. Just so folks know, this is going to be out. They can come see both of us in Atlanta, and then the following week in Houston at Research Ed. And I'm looking forward to meeting you in person.
I am as well. I am as well.
All right. So thank you, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, great.
If you're enjoying these podcasts, tell a friend. Also, please leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can follow me on Blue Sky at G Tavernetti, on Twitter, X at G Tavernetti, and you can learn more about me and the work I do at my website, tesscg.com. That's TESSCG.com, where you will also find information about ordering my books, Teach Fast, Focused, Adaptable, Structured Teaching, and maximizing the impact of coaching cycles.